The year was 1901. The New World, America. But for one city, for New York, it wasn't just the start of a new century. In the nighttime, when the sky was covered in fog and the streets were consumed by the hum of old steam engines, in one of the poorest parts of the city, on Manhattan, events would unfold that would echo through a whole generation. Jack the Ripper, whoever he was obsessed with justice, violence, and darkness. In London, his killing spree had ended in mystery, but it seemed his spirit could not leave his grim work unfinished. Rumors of him had reached America, and there he found new victims. One of the areas where poverty and suffering hid was the East Village, a place where evil thrived amidst mass migration, social tensions, and destitution. Here, in the darkened streets, women who sold their bodies for pennies roamed. It was here that, at night, when they wandered the streets, Jack chose his victims. No one knew how Jack arrived in America. Perhaps he was a simple immigrant, or maybe a man hiding his true identity, whose face no one could remember. He wore glasses and a wide-brimmed hat, dressed in a dark coat that concealed his figure. His first murder took place in a basement of an old building on Villager Street. The victim, a simple woman, a prostitute named Mary O'Reilly, was found with horrific signs of violence. Her body was mutilated, and the evidence left behind pointed to the same signature as in London. After the murder, Jack disappeared for several days. The police were in turmoil because the killer didn't just seem like a maniac, but someone who acted with the aim of humiliating and destroying. He wasn't local, and his actions were unusually cruel. Each killing grew more brutal and more refined. Julia Bennett was a young woman who had come to New York from the South, dreaming of becoming an actress. She lived in a small apartment in Chinatown. Her life was far from easy. She had to work in a beauty salon to pay the rent. At night, she walked home alone through dark neighborhoods full of danger. One evening, as Julia walked down the street, she felt a strange sensation that someone was following her. She looked back, but saw nothing. With each passing minute, her fear intensified, and the shadow trailing behind her grew closer. She quickened her pace, hoping it was just fear. But when she reached her building, she heard footsteps right behind her. Turning around, she saw a figure in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat. He silently approached and attacked. The next morning, her body was found in an empty alley, and with it began a chain of murders that held the city in fear. The police had finally begun to link the murders to the actions of a maniac. Chief Investigator John Hart was appointed to handle the case. He was a veteran of the police force who had seen many cases of violence and murder, but with each new clue, he became more concerned. The city, it seemed, was filled with darkness. The victims, as before, were often from the lower classes. But Jack never picked the same kind of person. Sometimes his victims were women, sometimes men, but they all shared one thing: they were essentially forgotten by society. Hart often thought that Jack was not just a maniac, but a symbol of a deeper issue. Meanwhile, the city was filled with fear. East Village emptied out after dark. People avoided walking at night, and the police were called to take desperate measures. No one knew when or where the next attack would come. At night, a week after the last murder, Jack the Ripper ventured into a new area, a farm located on the outskirts of the city. Here, simple farmers lived, far removed from city life. Jack felt no remorse, and this place would become yet another stage for his dark work. The Stewart family was murdered in their home. The bodies of the farmers and their daughter were found with bloody signs of violence. But there was one difference from all the previous murders: the killer left a letter. It was addressed to the police, but written in a strange hand that was hard to read. The text was harsh and unclear, but one thing was clear: Jack the Ripper was searching for something more. And his actions were part of something much larger. Each murder committed by Jack the Ripper left traces, not just in the city, but in the souls of its inhabitants. In East Village, dark corners and dusty basements no longer felt like places for work and rest. They had become places that could be the last stop. John Hart could find no logic in the victims. He and his team were constantly struggling with what seemed to be an attempt to understand why these people, and not others, became targets for the killer. Even his own colleagues in the police began to doubt themselves, thinking that this criminal was not just a murderer but something else, something they couldn't grasp. One night, several days after the murder of Lillian Campbell, Hart found himself at the scene of the crime where another body had been found. This time it was a young woman named Lillian Campbell who worked in a store on the corner of one of the streets. She had been found in the basement of an old building, hidden from the view of passers-by. Once again, signs of violence, once again unimaginable cruelty. But this time, Hart noticed something unusual. In the corner of the basement, there was something written, something that seemed to be part of a message. The handwriting was exactly the same as the previous letter left on the farm. Jack had left a trace again. Hart gathered his strength and, walking through the labyrinth of old buildings, felt a chill running down his spine as he realized he was close to an answer. He couldn't let himself give up, but the fear inside him began to grow. He knew the killer was somewhere nearby. Days after Lillian Campbell's murder, rumors about the killer spread throughout New York. People began avoiding going out at night, and many preferred to lock themselves indoors. The newspapers were filled with headlines, and the police received more and more anonymous threats from suspects who, in panic, tried to hide from the possible danger. Hart knew that time was running out. Despite his efforts, the police could not stop the murders, and the investigation continued to stall. One night, as Hart was walking the streets of the city, he encountered a street gang known for its cruelty and criminal connections. Their leader, a man named Joe Carter, notorious for his violent tendencies, was one of those who didn't fear the night's shadows. But when Hart began asking him questions about possible suspects in the murders, Joe Carter silently pointed to the dark alleys. "Where all is dark and hidden," said Carter, "you can find all those who hide from the light. And your killer is among them." Hart was puzzled by this response, but as soon as he turned to leave, he noticed something strange. Carter looked at him with an expression as though he knew more than he was willing to say. In his eyes, there was something unsettling. Perhaps Jack the Ripper wasn't just a killer, but someone connected to the city's darkest corners, someone Hart had never suspected. Jack the Ripper was not alone. In his grim history, amid his killings and brutal actions, there was a man he had been waiting for, his longtime enemy, who had been part of his past. That man's name was Henry Bradford. Henry was a psychopath who had once been a prisoner but had escaped. He was a maniac who had killed many women in various parts of the country. He and Jack the Ripper had crossed paths in London, and now, by strange coincidence, Bradford had returned to New York to continue his dark work. When Hart learned that Henry Bradford might be part of this story, he began to think that the whole chain of murders might not have been a coincidence. Bradford had probably been the one to nudge Jack onto the path of violence, and now both monsters were on the verge of crossing paths in this city. The police tried to find traces of Bradford, but he was skilled at hiding. In his search, Hart could not forget Joe Carter's words about the city's dark corners, about the people the night conceals. And so, when his search was on the verge of despair, Hart received an anonymous letter. It read only one word: tomorrow. Hart realized that this was a warning. The killer was already near. The next day, as night fell over New York, Hart knew this would be his last chance to catch Jack the Ripper. Everything pointed to the killer preparing to strike again. He headed to one of the darkest places in the city, which, as he had learned, was a gathering spot for all those who had once been part of the criminal world. It was an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, leaning and forgotten by all. When Hart entered, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. A body lay on the floor, and beside it stood Jack the Ripper, dressed in his dark coat, as always. But this time, the victim wasn't just any person, it was Henry Bradford. Henry had been killed, and Jack seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. "You don't understand," Jack said to Hart. "I've always been alone, always the last. This city, this place, it was made for me. And Bradford, he was just a pawn." Hart felt a chill run down his spine. This monster wasn't just a killer. He was part of something much bigger. Jack the Ripper vanished, as he always did. He became a ghost again, dissipating into the fog of the night. But his deeds left a mark on the heart of New York, as well as on the lives of those who never understood who he truly was. Every corner of the city was now soaked in fear. Hart knew that he could never find him. Jack wasn't just a person, he was an idea, an elusive shadow that the city couldn't capture. And despite his efforts, Jack the Ripper remained invisible, hidden, like the fog that envelopes the city. And so, the new world, still living in its ambitions and prosperity, remained torn apart by the dark corners where Jack the Ripper hid.